The weather forecast that morning said it would pass by the coast. Just some heavy rain, they said. Maybe some flooding in the usual spots. Nothing to panic about. Rebecca Chen didn't panic easily anyway. At 32 years old, she'd learned to handle most things life threw at her. She worked from home as a graphic designer, lived in a small apartment on the third floor of an older building, and spent most evenings with her orange cat Milo, watching shows on her laptop. Her life wasn't exciting, but it was hers. Safe, predictable, the kind of ordinary that feels boring until you lose it. By afternoon, the rain started, not the gentle kind that makes you want to curl up with a book. This was aggressive, angry rain that hit the windows like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. The wind picked up too, making the whole building creak in ways Rebecca had never heard before. She tried calling her friend Lisa, but the call wouldn't go through. The internet was already out. Her phone showed 1 bar of service, then none, then one again. She walked to the window and looked outside. The street below was already underwater and it was rising fast. That's when the power went out. Rebecca stood in the sudden darkness, her heart starting to race. She'd lived through storms before. Everyone in coastal towns had. But something about this felt different. Wrong. The building was shaking now, actually shaking, like it was trying to pull itself free from the ground. She grabbed her emergency bag from the closet. It was something her mother had made her put together years ago, back when her parents were still alive. Waterproof, filled with basics. A flashlight, some cash, copies of important documents sealed in plastic, a first aid kit, some protein bars. She'd made fun of her mom for being paranoid at the time. Now she whispered a thank you into the darkness. Milo was hiding under the bed, his eyes wide and reflecting her flashlight beam. She pulled him out gently, put him in his carrier, and held it close. The water outside was halfway up the first floor windows now. She could see cars floating past like toys in a bathtub. The building groaned again, louder this time. Something downstairs made a crashing sound that echoed up through the walls. Rebecca's hands started shaking. She needed to get higher. The roof. She had to get to the roof. She left everything behind except the emergency bag and Milo. Her laptop, her art supplies, her clothes, her photos, the quilt her grandmother made, the coffee mug collection she'd built over 10 years. All of it stayed behind as she ran for the stairs. The stairwell was pitch black and smelled like old concrete and fear. She could hear water rushing somewhere below. The beam from her flashlight bounced wildly as she climbed, Milo crying in his carrier, her own breath coming too fast. The roof access door was locked. Of course it was locked. It was always locked. Rebecca set down the carrier and threw her shoulder against the door. Nothing. She tried again, and again. Her shoulder screamed in pain, but she didn't stop. On the 5th try, something in the lock gave way, and the door burst open. Rain and wind hit her like a physical slap. The roof was exposed, nothing but flat concrete and a few ventilation units. Rebecca dragged Milo's carrier to the biggest unit and crouched behind it, trying to shield them both from the wind. That's when she realized how bad this really was. The world below was gone. Just water, everywhere, stretching out like an angry ocean. Trees were snapped in half. Roofs were torn off buildings. She watched the entire house float past, sideways, before it broke apart against something she couldn't see. The wind was so loud she couldn't think. Rain hammered down so hard it hurt. Rebecca wrapped her arms around the ventilation unit and held on. Milo's carrier was wedged between her body and the metal, the only shelter she could offer him. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time stopped meaning anything. Then she heard voices. Through the storm, through the wind and rain and her own terror, she heard someone shouting. Rebecca looked up and saw 3 people climbing onto the roof from the other side. An older man moving slowly, a young woman carrying a toddler, the child's face buried in her neck. A teenage boy soaked through, his eyes wild with fear. They saw her and moved closer, all of them gathering around the ventilation unit like it was a lifeboat. Nobody spoke at first. What was there to say? The older man was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. The young mother was shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The teenage boy just stared at the water below, his face blank with shock. Rebecca opened her emergency bag and pulled out the first aid kit. She cleaned the old man's wound as best she could while the mother held her flashlight. The man nodded his thanks but didn't speak. The boy refused to even look at them. They waited. That's all they could do. Wait and hold on and hope. At some point during the night, Milo stopped meowing. Rebecca's heart seized in her chest. She opened the carrier with shaking hands, terrified of what she'd find. But he was breathing, just exhausted, curled into the smallest ball possible. She tucked her jacket around him and closed the carrier again. The young mother's toddler cried off and on, a weak sound that barely carried over the wind. The mother sang to him, the same song over and over, her voice cracking. Rebecca lost feeling in her fingers, then her feet. The cold went deeper than her skin, settling into her bones. She'd never been this cold, never known it was possible to be this cold. When the sun finally started to rise, what it revealed was unrecognizable. Her town was gone. Just gone. Nothing looked the same. The buildings that were still standing were damaged beyond repair. Everything else was rubble or floating or simply disappeared. In the gray morning light, she heard it. The sound of helicopter blades. The rescue came in waves. Boats first, small ones that could navigate the debris. Then the helicopters for people on roofs and upper floors. Rebecca watched them pluck people from other buildings, moving systematically through the destruction. When the helicopter finally hovered above them, a man in a bright orange suit was lowered down on a cable. He helped the mother and child up first. Then the teenage boy. Then the older man. Rebecca was last. As they lifted her, still clutching Milo's carrier and her emergency bag, she looked down at her apartment building. At what used to be her apartment building. And then she watched it collapse. Just like that. The whole structure gave up, folding in on itself and disappearing into the muddy water below. Everything she owned, every piece of her life, every memory she hadn't digitized, every object that proved she'd existed for 32 years. Gone. In the helicopter, wrapped in a foil blanket that crinkled every time she moved, Rebecca felt something strange settle over her. Not quite relief, not quite grief, something else. Something that felt almost like possibility. She didn't know, yet but in that moment as they flew over the destroyed remains of her old life, a new question was forming in her mind. A dangerous question. A question that would change everything. What if she didn't go back? The hospital was chaos. Hundreds of people on cots in hallways, in waiting rooms, anywhere there was space. The smell of wet clothes and disinfectant hung heavy in the air. Nurses and doctors rushed between patients, their faces tight with exhaustion. Rebecca sat on a cot with a blanket around her shoulders, Milo's carrier beside her. Someone had checked her vitals and moved on. She wasn't injured enough to be a priority. Just cold and shaken, like half the people there. A volunteer came by with a clipboard. Name, date of birth, address, next of kin. Standard questions. Rebecca opened her mouth to answer and then stopped. Next of kin. She didn't have anyone. Her parents died in a car accident 3 years ago. No siblings. Her ex-boyfriend moved across the country 2 years back. She had friends, sure, but the kind you got coffee with occasionally. Not the kind who'd take you in after losing everything. Miss? The volunteer prompted. Rebecca gave her information mechanically. But as the volunteer moved to the next cot, something clicked in her mind. She replayed the conversation. The volunteer hadn't asked for ID, hadn't asked for proof of anything. How could they? Most people's documents were at the bottom of the floodwater. Around her, the chaos continued. Someone was crying. A child was asking for their mother. Announcements echoed over a loudspeaker about shelter locations and emergency services. Nobody was paying attention to one woman on a cot. Rebecca looked down at the emergency bag in her lap. Inside were copies of her documents sealed in plastic, her birth certificate, social security card, driver's license, Everything you'd need to prove who you were, or to become someone new. The thought hit her like cold water. Where had that come from? She shook her head, trying to clear it. She was in shock, that was all, not thinking straight. People didn't just disappear. People didn't just walk away from their lives. But what life? The apartment was gone. Her job's office building had flooded too, she'd heard someone say. 3 of her co-workers were missing. The town itself might take years to rebuild, if it rebuilt at all. She'd built such a careful life. Gone to college, got the safe degree, found the stable job, paid her bills on time, saved a little each month, followed all the rules. And for what? So a storm could wash it all away in one night? Rebecca stood up, legs shaky, and walked to the bathroom. She locked herself in a stall and sat on the closed toilet lid, breathing hard. She'd always played it safe. Always done what she was supposed to do. After her parents died, she'd thrown herself into being. Responsible, reliable, predictable. She'd stopped painting because it wasn't practical, stopped traveling because she needed to save money, stopped taking any risks at all because she was terrified of losing what little control she had left. And now she'd lost everything anyway. The volunteer had said they were buzzing people to shelters in other states, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, wherever there was space. Temporary housing until people figured out their next steps. Rebecca pulled out her phone. Somehow it still worked, though the screen was cracked. No service, but the photos were still there. She scrolled through them slowly. Her apartment, her desk, her coffee mug collection, selfies with Lisa and her other work friends. Everything looked so normal, so recently normal. She opened a new note and started typing. Not a plan exactly, just thoughts. Questions. What if nobody knew where she went? The records were a mess. Thousands displaced. Hundreds still missing. What if she got on one of those buses and just didn't get off where she was supposed to? Her finger hovered over the delete button. This was crazy. This was running away. This was something a scared kid did, not a grown woman. But maybe scared was exactly what she needed to be. Maybe scared was the only honest thing she'd felt in years. She deleted the note and walked back to her cot. A different volunteer was there now, handing out sandwiches and water bottles. Rebecca took both and ate without tasting anything. The next morning, they called for everyone heading to the Texas shelters. Rebecca picked up Milo's carrier, shouldered her emergency bag, and got in line. They loaded 40 people onto a bus, gave them each a bottle of water and a packet with information about the shelter. The bus pulled out of the parking lot. Rebecca watched through the window as they drove through what used to be her town. It didn't look real. It looked like a movie set, like something that couldn't possibly be an actual place where actual people had lived. The woman next to her was crying quietly. The man across the aisle was staring at nothing, his eyes empty. A kid a few rows back kept asking when they could go home. His mother's answer was too soft to hear. They drove for hours, through towns that were damaged, then towns that were fine, like the storm had just skipped over them randomly. The contrast was jarring. People going about their normal days while Rebecca's entire world had ended. At a rest stop in Texas, the driver announced a 30-minute break. Everyone filed off to use the bathroom, stretch their legs, buy snacks from the vending machines. Rebecca stood in the parking lot, Milo's carrier at her feet. The bus idled nearby, its door open. The driver was inside a convenience store. Other passengers were scattered around, on phones or smoking cigarettes, or just sitting on the curb looking lost. She could get back on the bus, go to the shelter, file the paperwork, get assigned temporary housing, start the long process of rebuilding the same life she'd had before. Or, Rebecca picked up Milo's carrier and started walking, not toward the bus, away from it, toward the road, toward the small town she could see in the distance. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. Nobody called after her. Nobody noticed. Why would they? Everyone was dealing with their own disaster. She walked for 20 minutes before she let herself look back. The rest stop was out of sight. The bus would leave soon. would arrive at the shelter without her. Her name would be on a list, crossed off, marked as transported. No one would know she'd gotten off early. In the chaos of everything, who would even think to check? The town ahead had a sign, population 3,200, small enough to be quiet, big enough to have what she needed. Rebecca found a motel on the edge of town, the kind that took cash and didn't ask many questions. The man at the desk barely looked at her as he handed over a key to room 7. The room was small and smelled like old carpet, but it had a bed and a bathroom and a door that locked. Rebecca set Milo's carrier down and opened it. He stepped out cautiously, sniffed the air, and immediately went to hide under the bed. "I know, buddy," she said quietly. "I don't know what we're doing either." She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out her phone. Still no service, but she didn't need service to think, to plan, to realize what she'd just done. She'd disappeared. Just like that. One decision. One walk away from a bus, and Rebecca Chen had vanished into the list of people still displaced by the storm. The guilt came then, heavy and sharp. Lisa would worry. Her co-workers would look for her. Her name would stay on the missing list, and people would assume the worst. But the guilt came with something else too. Something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Rebecca lay back on the scratchy motel bedspread and stared at the water-stained ceiling. She'd survived the worst night of her life. She'd lost everything. And somehow, impossibly, that meant she could be anything. Tomorrow she'd start figuring out what that meant. Tonight she just needed to breathe. For the first time since the storm, Rebecca Chen closed her eyes and slept. The first week in the motel room was the hardest. Rebecca barely left except to buy cat food and cheap meals from the diner down the street. She'd lie on the bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. Her phone still worked on the motel's Wi-Fi. She could see the news coverage, the death toll rising, the missing persons lists getting longer. Her own name was there, somewhere in the middle of hundreds of others. Rebecca Chen, 32, graphic designer, last seen at Memorial Hospital. Lisa had posted on social media, begging for information. "Please, if anyone has seen Rebecca, let me know. She's family to me." Rebecca's finger hovered over the keyboard a dozen times, ready to send a message, to say she was okay, to end the worry. But she never did. The guilt was a physical thing, sitting in her chest like a stone. But so was something else, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or possibility. The sense that she'd been living in a cage so small she hadn't even noticed the bars until she stepped outside. By the second week, the money from her emergency bag was running low. She needed a job. The problem was, getting a job meant paperwork, questions, a trail of information leading back to who she used to be. She started at the diner where she'd been eating. The owner was a woman in her 60s named Dorothy, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to see right through people. "You running from something?" Dorothy asked when Rebecca inquired about work. Rebecca's throat went dry. "I lost everything in the hurricane." "That's not what I asked." They stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Dorothy sighed. "I don't need your whole story, but I need to know you're not going to bring trouble to my door. No drugs, no stealing, no drama. You give me that, I'll give you cash under the table until you get yourself sorted. Deal?" Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice. "You start tomorrow, 6 in the morning. Don't be late." The work was hard. Longer hours than she'd ever worked, standing on her feet all day, dealing with customers who were sometimes rude, sometimes kind, always demanding. Her back ached. Her feet developed blisters. She fell into bed each night too exhausted to think, but it was honest work, simple work. Nobody asked about her portfolio or her skills or where she went to college. They just wanted their coffee refilled and their eggs cooked right. Rebecca started introducing herself as Claire. Not a dramatic change, just different enough. "Claire Morrison," she'd say when people asked, "from back east. Came here after losing everything in the storm." It was mostly true, which made it easier to remember. The town was small enough that newcomers were noticed, but big enough that people minded their own business. Most folks in this part of Texas had their own struggles. The oil industry had dried up years ago, taking good jobs with it. People understood hard times. They understood starting over. After a month, Dorothy offered her more hours and a slight raise. "You're a good worker," she said. "Reliable, that's rare these days." Rebecca found a room to rent in an older woman's house on the edge of town. Mrs. Hoffman was 73, widowed, and happy to have someone else in the house. She didn't ask many questions, didn't require references, just wanted first month's rent and a promise that Milo wouldn't scratch the furniture. The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking an overgrown garden. Mrs. Hoffman made too much food and always invited Claire to dinner. They'd eat together in comfortable silence, watching game shows on an ancient television. Life developed a rhythm. Wake up, work the morning shift, come home, help Mrs. Hoffman with yard work or groceries, eat dinner, sleep. Weekends she'd walk around town, learning the streets, the shops, the people. She started going to the library. It was a small building, barely 3 rooms, but it had books and free internet, and a librarian named Patricia who remembered everyone's name after meeting them once. Rebecca would sit at the computer and search for news about the hurricane. The coverage was dying down now 3 months later. People were moving on, rebuilding or relocating. The missing persons list was smaller. Some people had been found. Others were presumed dead. Her name was still there. She typed up an email to Lisa a dozen times, deleted it a dozen times. What would she even say? "Sorry I let you think I was dead, but I needed a fresh start." It sounded insane. It was insane. But she was doing it anyway. One Saturday, Patricia asked if she'd be interested in helping with the children's reading hour. They needed someone to organize the books and maybe read to the kids occasionally. "I'm not really good with children," Rebecca said. "Nobody is until they try," Patricia replied with a smile. "Besides, you've got a kind face. Kids respond to that." Rebecca started volunteering on Saturday mornings. It was strange at first, reading picture books to a handful of kids while their parents browsed the shelves. But the kids didn't care about her past or her secrets. They just wanted to know what happened to the caterpillar or the mouse or the girl who could talk to animals. She found herself looking forward to it. The simple joy of a child's laugh, the way their eyes went wide at a good story. It reminded her of something she'd forgotten. That life could be more than just surviving. It could be good. Winter came. Rebecca bought a thick coat from the thrift store and learned to appreciate the clear, cold Texas mornings. She started sketching again, just doodles at first, on napkins during slow periods at the diner. Then in a cheap notebook she bought at the dollar store. The drawings were different from her old design work. Looser, more emotional. She drew the storm sometimes, the water, the roof where she'd clung to the ventilation unit. She drew Milo sleeping in patches of sunlight. She drew Mrs. Hoffman's garden, the faces of the kids at story time. Dorothy caught her sketching one day during her break. She picked up the notebook without asking and flipped through the pages. "These are good," she said finally. "Real good. You should do something with them." "They're just doodles," Rebecca said, embarrassed. "Nothing's ever just anything." Dorothy handed the notebook back. "You've got a gift. Seems a shame to waste it on napkins." That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to Mrs. Hoffman's gentle snoring from down the hall, and thought about gifts. About the life she'd left behind, where she'd used her art to sell products for companies that didn't care about her. About this new life where she drew for herself for the simple pleasure of it. 6 months had passed since the storm. 6 months since Rebecca Chen had disappeared. 6 months since Claire Morrison had appeared in a small Texas town with nothing but a cat and a bag of emergency supplies. She pulled out her phone and opened the browser, typed in her own name. The search results were mostly old now. A few memorial pages. Lisa's post had slowed down. The last one was from 2 weeks ago. "I'll never stop hoping you're out there somewhere, safe and happy." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. She typed a response, "I am. I promise I am." But she didn't post it. Couldn't post it. Instead, she saved it as a draft and closed the app. She'd made her choice. For better or worse, Claire Morrison was who she was now. And slowly, carefully, she was building a life that felt more real than anything she'd had before. The guilt was still there. It probably always would be. But it was quieter now, easier to live with. Rebecca turned off her phone and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd wake up early, work her shift, help Mrs. Hoffman plant spring bulbs, read to the kids at the library. Small things, simple things, good things. For the first time in her life, that felt like enough. The bookstore appeared on Main Street one Tuesday morning like it had always been there. Rebecca walked past it 3 times before she realized it was new. The sign said Second Chances Books in faded gold letters, and the window display showed worn paperbacks arranged around a small plant. She pushed open the door. A bell chimed. Inside smelled like old paper and coffee, the kind of smell that makes you want to stay a while. An older man stood behind the counter, organizing a stack of hardcovers. He looked up and smiled. Come in, come in. Don't let the mess fool you. We're actually open." "You just opened?" Rebecca asked last week. Still getting organized. He gestured around at the boxes and half-empty shelves. "I'm Howard. Used to run a shop like this in Austin, but city life got too expensive. Figured a small town could use a good bookstore." Rebecca wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines. She'd always loved bookstores. Before the storm, she'd spent Saturday mornings in one back home, drinking overpriced coffee and browsing for hours. "You hiring?" The words were out before she'd thought them through. Howard looked at her with interest. "Might be. You know books?" "I love them. And I'm good with people. I work at Dorothy's Diner, but I could do evenings and weekends here." He studied her for a moment. "Tell you what, help me shelve these boxes today and we'll see how it goes. If you're good, the job's yours. Minimum wage and all the books you can read." Rebecca stayed until closing. They worked side by side, sorting books by genre, alphabetizing, creating displays. Howard talked about his daughter in California, about his late wife who'd loved mysteries, about the books that had saved him during hard times. He didn't ask about her past, didn't push. Just let her work and talk when she felt like it. By the end of the day, she had the job. Working at the bookstore changed something in Rebecca. The diner was survival. This was living. She'd arrive in the evenings after her morning shift at Dorothy's and spend hours surrounded by stories. Howard let her reorganize sections, pick books for displays, recommend reads to customers. She started a small art corner, displaying local artists' work between the shelves. Just postcards and small prints at first. Howard encouraged her to add her own sketches. "Nobody wants to see my drawings," she said. "Try me." Rebecca brought in 3 pieces, simple watercolors of the Texas landscape. The empty fields outside town, the sunset over the diner, Mrs. Hoffman's garden in full bloom. Howard hung them near the register without a word. By the end of the week, all 3 had sold. "Told you," he said, handing her the cash. She stared at the money in her hand. It wasn't much, but it felt like something bigger. Like permission, like maybe the part of her that created things hadn't died in the storm after all. Rebecca started painting more. Late at night in her room, after Mrs. Hoffman had gone to bed, she'd set up at the small desk by the window and work. The subjects came naturally. The storm was there always, but transformed. No longer just destruction. Now it was power and survival and change. She painted water and wind and broken buildings, but also the helicopter that saved her, the orange suit of the rescue worker, the sunrise after the longest night, the motel room where she'd made her decision, the diner booth where Dorothy had given her a chance. Howard started displaying them in the bookstore. People noticed. A woman from the next town over commissioned a piece for her living room. A man bought one for his daughter who'd survived a different hurricane years ago. Word spread the way it does in small towns. "Have you seen Claire's paintings at the bookstore? There's something special." Rebecca felt herself splitting into 2 people. There was Claire, the waitress and artist who'd emerged from tragedy to build something new. And there was Rebecca, the woman who'd left people behind, who was living a lie, who checked her old life online late at night when she couldn't sleep. The 2 couldn't coexist forever. She knew that. But she didn't know what to do about it. Then on a Thursday afternoon in spring, a woman walked into the bookstore. She was maybe 40, dressed in business casual, carrying a leather bag that looked expensive. She browsed the shelves, picked up 2 novels, and then stopped in front of Rebecca's paintings. She stood there for a long time. Too long. Rebecca watched from behind the register, something cold forming in her stomach. The woman pulled out her phone and took a picture of one of the paintings. Then another. Then she walked to the counter with her books. These paintings, she said, pointing. Who's the artist? That's me, Rebecca said, trying to keep her voice steady. They're remarkable. Really powerful. The woman paused. I'm Catherine. I run a gallery in Austin. We focus on emerging artists, particularly those working through trauma narratives. She pulled a business card from her bag. I'd love to talk to you about a possible show. Rebecca's hand shook as she took the card. I'm not really a professional artist, just someone who paints sometimes. The best art comes from people who just need to create. Catherine smiled. Think about it. My number's on the card. After she left, Rebecca sat on the stool behind the register, her heart racing. A gallery show in Austin. Her work hung on walls seen by hundreds of people, maybe thousands, her old city, where Lisa still lived, where people might recognize her work, her style, the way she saw the world. She'd been so careful. Kept her head down, stayed in a small town, built a quiet life. And now someone was offering to put her in a spotlight. That night she couldn't paint. Couldn't think. She took Milo and sat in Mrs. Hoffman's garden, watching the stars come out. Mrs. Hoffman joined her, moving slowly, easing into the lawn chair with a soft grunt. They sat in silence for a while. Something's troubling you, the older woman finally said. Someone wants to show my work in a gallery, in the city. That's wonderful news, is it? Rebecca's voice cracked. What if I'm not ready? What if people see it and it's not good enough? What if everything changes? Mrs. Hoffman was quiet for a moment. Claire, honey, change is the only thing that's certain. You can hide from it, but it'll find you anyway. Might as well walk toward it on your own terms. Rebecca looked at her. You ever had to choose between the life you had and the life you could have? Every day after my husband died. Mrs. Hoffman reached over and patted her hand. You think I wanted to rent out rooms to strangers? Open my home to people I didn't know. But I did it anyway because the alternative was living alone in a house too full of memories. Sometimes the scary choice is the right one. That weekend, Rebecca painted something different. She painted herself, not as she was now and not as she was before, but as both. Two faces overlapping, neither quite complete without the other. She called it After the Storm. On Monday morning, she called Catherine's number. Her hand was shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. I'll do it, she said when Catherine answered. The show, I'm in. That's fantastic. Catherine's enthusiasm crackled through the line. I'll need some information from you. Biography, artist statement, that sort of thing. And we should meet to discuss the pieces you'll include. Biography, artist statement. Rebecca closed her eyes. Here it was. The moment where her two lives would collide. Can I get back to you with those details? She asked. Of course. Take your time. We're looking at a fall opening, so we have a few months. After hanging up, Rebecca sat in the bookstore's back room, surrounded by boxes of books waiting to be shelved. She pulled out her phone and opened the browser, typed her own name again. The search results looked different now. There were fewer recent mentions. The missing persons list had been archived. Life had moved on. She found Lisa's profile. The last post about her was from 6 months ago. Lisa had moved on too, in her own way. Still missing her, still thinking of her, but living her life. Rebecca typed a message. Deleted it, typed another. Deleted that too. She couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep living between two worlds. The gallery show would force her hand eventually. Better to face it now, on her own terms. But how? And what would she lose when the truth came out? Rebecca didn't have answers. All she knew was that Claire Morrison had built something worth protecting, and Rebecca Chen had left behind people who deserved the truth. Somehow, she'd have to find a way to honor both. The email came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the gallery opening. Rebecca was eating breakfast with Mrs. Hoffman when her phone buzzed. The subject line made her blood run cold. Question about Claire Morrison. The sender was someone named Victoria Blake. The message was short. I'm a journalist writing about Hurricane Helena survivors. I came across your artwork and it reminded me of someone I used to know. Would you be willing to talk? Rebecca set down her coffee cup carefully, trying to keep her hands from shaking. You okay, honey? Mrs. Hoffman asked. Fine. Just work stuff. She excused herself and went back to her room, read the email 5 more times, clicked on Victoria's profile. She was a freelance journalist who'd written extensively about the hurricane, about displacement, about the people who'd never been found. This was it. The moment Rebecca had been both dreading and expecting since the day she walked away from that bus. She could ignore the email, block the sender, cancel the gallery show, disappear again, or she could face it. Rebecca's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before she started typing. I'm willing to talk, but it needs to be in person, and I need your word that nothing gets published without my approval. The response came within an hour. Agreed. I can meet you this weekend. Name the place. They met at a coffee shop 2 towns over, neutral ground where nobody knew Claire Morrison. Victoria was younger than Rebecca expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and a recorder she kept visible on the table between them. Thank you for meeting me, Victoria said. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what this is about, but your paintings, the ones Catherine showed me, they have this quality. Like they're painted by someone who was there, in the storm. Rebecca wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. What makes you think that? Because I've interviewed 50 survivors. I know what that kind of trauma looks like when it gets translated into art. Victoria leaned forward slightly. And because one of the pieces is called After the Storm, and it shows a woman with 2 faces, 2 identities, like she died in one life and was reborn in another. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too hot. Rebecca could feel her pulse in her throat. I'm not here to expose anyone, Victoria continued gently. I'm trying to understand something. There were hundreds of people who used the storm as an opportunity to start over, some for bad reasons, running from debt or crime or responsibility, but others just needed to become someone new to survive. I want to tell that story, the real story. Rebecca stared at her coffee. And if someone did that, started over, what happens to them? Depends. If they committed fraud, collected insurance money they weren't entitled to, that's one thing. But if they just walked away? If they just chose not to come back? Victoria shrugged. It's complicated, morally gray, which is what makes it worth writing about. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Rebecca looked up. My name is Rebecca Chen. I was listed as missing after the hurricane, but I wasn't missing, I just left. Victoria didn't reach for her recorder, didn't pull out a notebook. She just listened. Rebecca told her everything. The storm, the roof, the rescue, the hospital. The moment she realized she could walk away. The bus ride, the motel, the new name. Dorothy and the diner in Mrs. Hoffman's house. The bookstore and the paintings and the life she'd built from nothing. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. I just couldn't go back to being the person I was. She was so small, so scared of everything. And I know that's selfish. I know people worried, Lisa especially. But I was drowning long before the hurricane came. The storm just showed me that. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Have you thought about reaching out, letting people know you're alive? Every single day. But what do I say? Sorry I let you mourn me, but I'm actually fine. Just living under a different name in Texas? Rebecca laughed bitterly. There's no good way to do this. Maybe not good, but there might be honest. Victoria pulled out her phone and showed Rebecca her screen. I've been working on this piece for months. About people who use disasters to disappear. I have 3 other stories. Yours would be the 4th. But here's the thing. I won't use your real name if you don't want me to. I can keep you anonymous. Rebecca shook her head slowly. If I do this, it needs to be all of it. My real name. My face, everything, otherwise I'm still hiding. Still lying. You sure? No, but I'm going to do it anyway. They talked for 3 more hours. Victoria asked careful questions, took notes, recorded some parts with Rebecca's permission. By the end, Rebecca felt hollowed out and somehow lighter at the same time. One more thing, Victoria said as they prepared to leave. If this publishes, your life is going to change. People will have opinions. Some will understand. Others won't. Are you ready for that? Rebecca thought about Mrs. Hoffman and Dorothy and Howard. About the kids at the library and the customers who bought her paintings. About the life she'd built as Claire Morrison. I don't think anyone's ever ready, she said. But I'm tired of being scared. The article published 3 weeks later. After the storm, the people who disappeared and the lives they built appeared online first, then in print. Rebecca's story was featured prominently, with photos of her artwork and a picture Victoria had taken at the coffee shop. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Lisa called within hours of publication, crying so hard she could barely speak. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? I thought you were dead. I know. I'm so sorry. Sorry? Sorry? Lisa's voice cracked. I grieved for you. I spoke at your memorial service. And you were alive this whole time? The conversation was brutal. Lisa was angry, hurt, confused. She hung up twice before calling back. But she called back. I need time, she finally said. I need to process this. But Rebecca, I'm glad you're alive. Even if I'm furious with you right now, I'm glad you're alive. Other calls followed. Former co-workers, curious journalists, people from her old life reaching out with everything from understanding to anger to simple relief. The town's reaction was different. Dorothy pulled her aside at the diner the morning after the article dropped. So you're not really Claire Morrison, she said. No, I'm Rebecca Chen. But I'm also Claire. I've been Claire for almost 2 years now. Dorothy studied her face for a long moment. Then she nodded. You're still a good worker. That's what matters to me. Though you could have trusted me with the truth, I know. I should have. Mrs. Hoffman's response was the one that surprised her most. The older woman hugged her tight and whispered, I knew you were running from something. I just didn't know what. But you've been a blessing in my life, whoever you are. Howard at the bookstore just smiled and said, Everyone's got a story. Yours is more interesting than most. The gallery show went forward. Catherine actually thought the controversy helped, bringing more attention to the work. People came to see the paintings of the woman who'd survived the storm twice, once in water and once in transformation. Rebecca stood in the gallery on opening night, surrounded by her art, surrounded by pieces of both her lives. Lisa came, standing in the back, arms crossed, but she came. Dorothy and Mrs. Hoffman and Howard came. Patricia from the library brought half the book club, and Rebecca, who was also Claire, who was something entirely new, stood in the center of it all and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Whole. Not perfect. Not forgiven by everyone. Some people from her old life would never understand. Some people in her new life felt betrayed by the lie. But she was whole. She'd survived the storm. She'd built a life no one knew about. And now everyone knew, and she was still standing. A woman approached, someone Rebecca didn't recognize. Your work is beautiful, she said. Especially that one. She pointed to the self-portrait, the one with 2 faces. What's it called? Rebecca smiled. It's called After the Storm I Found Myself Twice. The woman nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what it looks like. After the crowd thinned, Lisa finally approached. They stood awkwardly for a moment before Lisa spoke. I'm still angry. I know. But I missed you. The real you. Not the careful, scared version you were before. This person, whoever she is, she's more alive. I missed you too. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. Rebecca went home that night to Mrs. Hoffman's house, to her small room with the garden view, to Milo curled up on the bed. She'd lost the life she had. She'd built a new one. And now somehow she was learning to live with both. The storm had taken everything, but it had also given her something back. The courage to be more than she'd been. The strength to face the truth. The wisdom to know that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to find out who you really are. She opened her sketchbook and started drawing. Not the storm this time, not the past or the present. Just tomorrow, whatever that might bring.